Hi there, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We are on the hour, so let's get started. My name is Charlotte Bergen. I'm Capacity Building Coordinator here at INEE, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar, but I just wanted to say a huge thanks to the INEE team behind the scenes making this possible. And a welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things for us about the webinar. So just to reassure you that your mics are muted and your videos aren't on, so we can't hear your background noise. That we do that on purpose to improve the audio quality for the webinar itself and the panelists, but we do still want to hear from you. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen there is a Q&A function, and we encourage you throughout the webinar today to please post your questions, because we'd love to hear from you. And you can also use the chat box for any comments you might have. Also, just a reminder that you can access closed captioning in English at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the CC there. And lastly, but not least, the session is being recorded, and the recording and presentations will be shared on the INEE website and with all of you. So do know that will happen. But Andrew, if we could go to the next slide, let's get started on today's webinar. So we're here today together to celebrate the minimum standards with the launch of two new INEE tools, the Monitoring and Evaluation Indicator Framework and the Competency Framework for EIE professionals. And these are two tools that we know our members have been requesting for some time and that members have been working on for some time. So we're really excited that they're now available for you all to use on the INEE website in all of our working languages, so French, Spanish, Arabic, Portuguese and English. And in fact, we will be hoping to, throughout this webinar, to encourage you to pick up and use these tools, and we'll be asking for your feedback. So we'll have a short webinar today just to share more information about the tools and respond to your questions. But hopefully in several months' time, we'll be able to come back together to hear from all of you and your experiences using these tools. And so we always say that INEE exists because of and for our members. And it's indeed our members who have been working together to create these tools through the Standards and Practice Working Group. And I'm delighted to be joined by a panel today of colleagues who are involved in that. So if I could just ask them to turn on their video. We're joined by Amy Parker, who's the Portfolio and Technical Lead from the Girls Education Challenge, and Kathleen Denny, who's an independent consultant who's been supporting this work. And we're also joined by Jeff Dow, who's the Educational Technical Advisor for IRC, and all have been instrumental in this work. So thanks to them and the wider groups involved in working on these. And indeed, when the Standards and Practice Working Group came together, which is a couple of years ago now, they really wanted to prioritise supporting use of the standards and developing and working together, taking off their institutional hats and coming together to collaborate on these tools that would help us all in the sector put the standards into practice. So we're excited to share them today. But before I hand over to our wonderful panel, I do just want to give everyone a quick reminder about the standards themselves. So Andrew, if you would move to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. As you all know, INEE is made up of over 18,000 members around the world in 190 different countries. But the thing that unites us all is this shared mission, this shared goal to ensure the right to a quality, safe and relevant education for all who live in emergency and crisis contexts through prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. And the standards, the minimum standards for education, preparedness, response and recovery are the foundational tool resource for helping us all, enabling us all as a sector to do just that and to work towards that mission. So they're at the heart of everything we do. And just to remind everybody about the standards, they are of course based on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, Education for All and the Humanitarian Charter to represent universal goals for helping adults and children achieve the right to life with dignity. And they're in addition to the Sphere humanitarian standards, which you can access all via the INEE website, as well as the Sphere website. And they really are key to quality, accountability and coherence in our sector. Just to remind everyone that the standards promote a minimum level of access to quality education for all persons, including those affected by emergencies. And they were developed by many of you. We know over 3,500 educationalists from over 52 countries work together to develop the standards. So it really is something owned and shared by all of us in the sector. So just a quick reminder that about the standards, you can find everything you need on the INEE website. So there are over 22 different translated versions, different contextualized versions you can access, as well as guidance and access to training and capacity building opportunities related to the standards. So it's a great opportunity to remind ourselves about quite how key these are to our sector, and these really are the basis for these two tools, which will hopefully help us incorporate these more and more into our work, and to continue to have them at the heart of everything we do. And so do take a look at the website if you need a reminder or a refresher. But that's enough from me. Happy to take further questions on the standards, and I'm delighted to hand over to our monitoring and evaluation colleagues to share the first tool, the indicator framework. So Amy, over to you.
Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks for that great framing of this webinar. If you could move to the next slide, please, Andrew. Thank you. So newly launched is the M&E Indicator Framework. It was launched last week, actually, and I think it's really important to say that it's a culmination of a couple of years' work by a subgroup of the Standards and Practice Working Group. And as Charlotte says, this really is a space where we all take off our institutional hats, and we really work together to look at trying to respond to any gaps or looking to promote the minimum standards in this case. And it was a very deliberate decision to circle around the minimum standards. As Charlotte says, you know, it absolutely is a seminal piece of work for the EIE sector. And I think we all felt that it was really important to revisit and to look at promoting as much as possible. And a rationale for the indicator framework was very much around the fact that whilst the minimum standards are a key reference tool, and something that I'm sure everybody on this call has done is referenced to in proposals and used as a framing for programming. With no associated indicators, it's been quite difficult to demonstrate either adherence to the minimum standards or working towards them. So as a group, we set out on the work to fill this gap, and to provide an easy access open source framework that would provide examples of indicators that would allow organisations to do exactly that, to demonstrate adherence to and monitoring against the minimum standards. So that's both the rationale, but also the purpose. And I think in terms of coming to the process, it's important to say that we didn't start from scratch, and that we weren't trying to recreate the wheel. There are lots and lots of indicator banks out there. So our first start was to review and do a mapping of indicator resources against the minimum standards. So we did access some of the a number of different indicator resources from ECHO, Education Cannot Wait, the Global Education Cluster, who had also recently done some work against the minimum standards, OCHA, Teaching in Crisis Contexts, plus others. But the key piece of work here was mapping them against each domain and standard, and then working out where there were gaps, and in which case new indicators were created. We took a deliberate decision to try and keep the list short. I mean, there are multiple indicators that could go against every standard, so there was a big process of sort of gathering as much as we could and then whittling down to what we felt was a fair representation and a good starting point. We did do some consultations, so I don't know if anybody on this call was on a consultation webinar probably about 6 months ago now. I've lost track of time, whereby we split out into some working groups and then had a look through the indicators as well, and all of that feedback went back into these and fed into revision, and then the launch of the framework itself, which of course happened last week. If you go on to the next slide, please, Andrew. Thanks. In terms of, so there's a I don't know if anybody's managed to access the framework itself, but hopefully it's very familiar in terms of layout and certainly highlighting the domains and standards. But in terms of uses, it really is, the ideal would be to use it as an accompaniment to the minimum standards, and to use them at the same time. That said, it's certainly not something that the INEE is going to enforce, and there's no aim to replace donor or organisational indicator banks. Absolutely, it's there for all actors within the EIE sector to access and to use as is useful, and hopefully it will prove a useful tool as various other indicator banks are developed. It's also useful at various different stages of the cycle, whether it's at design stage or whether it's at implementation stages. And then contextualization is key. You know, this is a standard framework at this stage, but as we all know, things will need to be adapted and changed according to the context within which you work, and that could come down to definitions of what you're measuring, for example. So there are a number of things in here around measuring learning outcomes or measuring social emotional learning. So around those definitions, it's going to be incredibly important to contextualize those, as I'm sure everybody works towards anyway. Then in terms of the future and next steps, you will see within the framework that we have a column for tools. Some of those have got links in, and some of those are to be developed. And this is a little bit of a call to action in terms of reaching out to us as and when you're starting to implement this framework. If you do have tools that you would like to share and that have proved helpful, it would be great to be able to receive those and to go through. We have a vetting process within INEE, but that would be great in terms of adding to those. We will be looking at reviewing and revising this. This is very much a first draft and a working document, so it's not going to be hopefully a document that is sat gathering dust, and we are looking at it being integrated into future INEE minimum standards, any revisions of these tools, as I'm sure people have heard about. I think finally to say the immediate next step, however, is a super exciting one in terms of a usage pilot of the framework. And at this stage, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Kathleen, who can walk us through this process a little bit. Looking forward to any questions, and thanks ever so much. Over to you, Kathleen.
All right, hi everyone. So I'll quickly go over the piloting process. You can go to the next slide. Great. Okay, so we are calling this a usage pilot. So it's not a traditional pilot. Usually when you do a pilot, you might assume that we're asking each organization to take the full framework and integrate all the different indicators and measurement tools into their programming and provide full feedback on the framework. But we're not doing that. Instead, we're doing something much more flexible. So we're simply providing the framework and seeing what organizations choose to do with it. So that's why we call it a usage pilot. We kind of made up that term. So we have two questions that we're going to be looking into for this pilot. And the first one is, how useful is the indicator framework for organizations working in the EIE space? So basically what we want to know about this is who's using the framework, how is the framework being used, what needs to be adapted or contextualized, to what extent were each of the indicators useful or not useful, and what additional resources could be developed to help organizations use the framework. Our second set of research questions are kind of around this question of, does the indicator framework support harmonized measurement in the EIE sector? Because that's kind of one of the main purposes of developing the framework. So we want to see its impact there. So our organizations tending to adopt the full framework or parts of it, which indicators are most useful to aligning to the minimum standards, and are there any other resources that we can develop to help with harmonization? So that's kind of the research questions and the purpose for the pilot. And if you click on the next slide, we can kind of see the pilot process. So this is pretty simple, but we are working with 5 to 6 organizations, and each organization may use the indicator framework in the pilot for whatever purpose they choose. So they could use it for project planning, for needs assessments, for project monitoring and evaluation, capacity building, harmonization and coordination, etc. So we provide a couple of different ideas. We provide a bit of support to help the organizations plan for the pilot. And then basically we do an introductory webinar, planning call with me. And then once the organizations are using the pilot, they will kind of fill out a monitoring report to kind of track their ongoing usage of the framework. And then we'll have an exit interview at the end of the pilot just to hear full feedback on the process and kind of answer all of the research questions that I just mentioned. So we currently have 3 organizations that have fully committed to doing the pilot with us, but we're looking for 2 to 3 more organizations. So if you are interested in joining the pilot in your organization, you can email me at the email on the slide. I'll type it in the chat box as well so that you guys can see it after we move on. But yeah, that would be great if you guys could email me if you're interested in piloting, because we really need a couple more organizations, and yeah, we're excited to get your feedback on the tools. So that's it for me, and now I'll hand over to Charlotte. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathleen and Amy. Yeah, really excited to see this come to life. I know it's been in the works for some time, and just a huge thanks to both of you and our wider colleagues in the network who've been developing this. And yes, please do get in touch if you'd like to use it. And I'm now delighted to hand over to Jeff, who leads our work around professional development and the Standards and Practice Working Group, to tell us more about the competency framework. So over to you, Jeff. Oh, and just a reminder, please do keep these great questions coming. We want to hear from you guys, so do ask these questions as the presentations continue. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Charlotte. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the professional development competency framework, the rationale behind the framework, the intended uses. I'll go a little bit into the structure and design and speak a little bit about the future for the competency framework. So the Professional Development Competency Framework was originally launched in Nairobi in October 2018 by the Standard and Practice Working Group. So we worked on this for a couple of years, lots of feedback, improvements, design, translation, and we officially launched in late 2020 in all 5 INEE working languages. So now as we look towards the future, we're really trying to think about how we operationalize the framework, how we ensure that it's being used, that we're improving it, and we're maintaining its relevance for the sector. So we really want this to be kind of a living, breathing document. Next slide, please. So the competency framework was developed to address a clear lack of standards around the knowledge and skills required by EIE practitioners and a general lack of cohesiveness across actors in the EIE space. So we wanted to develop a framework that was grounded and rooted in the minimum standards to provide a structured career path for practitioners and clarity on skill development, as well as to help identify skill gaps amongst staff for both recruitment and continued professional development for staff members. So again, the competency framework was developed around the structure of the minimum standards with the goal of improving standardization in the sector and the general uptake of the minimum standards. So you'll see the framework is identical to the minimum standards in structure. Next slide, please. So the framework was developed to fit a specific gap in the sector, as I discussed, the lack of standardization, a lack of standardized skills and competencies, which indicate different levels of proficiency for staff in the sector. It was intended to be useful for areas such as staff recruitment, for job descriptions, to be drafted based on relevant skills and expertise in the sector, for benchmarking staff learning and professional development based on clear, sequential, and progressive skill levels for the different competencies for the sector. The framework can also be used for organizational planning, project planning, and design. The goal is to meaningfully engage with the minimum standards for education and emergencies, and see what it means to put these standards into practice, both for staff technical skills as well as for project implementation. Next slide, please. So the next slide, you'll see an actual example from the competency framework. This is from the access and learning environment, which is the second domain of the minimum standards. So you'll see the structure. You'll see the competency domain. You'll see a clear definition for the competency, and then you'll see 3 levels of skills linked to the competency, which show kind of the benchmark knowledge and experience for practitioners for this specific competency. So for example, you'll see access here and specifically barriers to education, which is a core area for many of our EIE programs. So you'll see in the example, skill level 1 normally relates to the ability of new practitioners to the sector. So in this case, it refers to the ability of a practitioner to describe key barriers facing out-of-school children and follow an implementation plan to support improved access. Level 2, you'll see the kind of increase of complexity. It refers to staff with some experience in programming, in adapting and contextualizing information and approaches. So in this case, it would mean a practitioner with the skill to analyze and identify out-of-school children and the barriers affecting their access, and then apply relevant and tailored strategies to reduce these barriers. Finally, you'll see skill level 3 refers to skill levels for expert practitioners in this area who are able to create, design, adapt, and lead others in this work. For this domain, it refers to practitioners who are able to synthesize and design strategies which address multidimensional barriers to access. So you can see the increasing skill levels between these competencies. And we'd look to level 3 expertise to help guide other practitioners who are at more beginner or intermediate skill levels for these specific competency domains. Next slide, please. So as I've discussed, our working group is really now focused on increasing the practical utilization of the competency framework. So a couple of years of work went into this, and now we really want to understand how it's being used by practitioners. We want to understand how we can encourage this use and how we can provide use cases to encourage different ways of uptake by sector actors. So some of the work that we've been doing is looking at integration with the Child Protection Alliance. They've just launched a new competency framework for professional development as well. And we've worked on an annex, which basically shows the overlap between child protection and education and emergencies, and how those skills and competencies are transferable between the two sectors, which is really important. We're working also to link the framework to training opportunities. Practitioners will be able to undertake a self-assessment of their skills and then be linked based on skill gaps to relevant training opportunities that are freely available online. And we also want to make sure that new trainings and professional development opportunities are linked and benchmarked against the competency framework and reference the specific domains, competencies, and skill levels clearly and transparently for practitioners. Finally, aligned with what Kathleen was talking about, we're looking to develop some use cases for the competency framework. Again, to see how practitioners are actually using the framework to improve their work on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. So For these use cases, again, we're hoping to see interest from the wider EIE community, starting with those on the call today. First, to hear feedback on how you could see using the framework. Maybe it's something that we just haven't thought about before. And then to start to collect some experiences on the actual utilization of the framework. So an example here is a hypothetical use case of the competency framework for the Afghanistan context to show how this could be done at country level. So this would include a short background and context, how it was actually applied, the challenges and the lessons learned, and any other kind of shared learning for other contexts. So again, we would be happy to guide interested participants through this process. We're looking for people who are interested, again, to kind of use this, to tell us how they're using it, and to share their experiences of using the competency framework with support from our working group. Next slide, please. Again, you know, we're looking for organizations or individuals who are interested to contact us. You can see my email up on the screen. You can feel free to contact me directly. Me and the rest of our working group members would be happy to guide you through this simple process in terms of capturing learning. And again, the point here is that we can kind of better adapt, adjust, and share with other country contexts to really kind of maximize the usefulness of the competency framework. So I'll stop there and thank you very much. And I think we'll have some time for questions and answers. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and to the wider group of professional development colleagues who have made this possible. I'm really excited to see this out there. And again, encourage all of you on the line today to pick up this tool and use it, and to let us know about your experiences with it. Thanks to all the panelists. I'm going to actually invite you all now to turn on your videos again, because we have some fantastic questions coming in. I'm also actually going to ask two more panelists to join us. So we're also joined by Annie Smiley, who's with IRC, the Deputy Project Director of Research for Play Matters, and Sebastian Hein, Programme Specialist at UNESCO, IAEP, and previously a consultant who helped develop the indicator framework. So we've got some more colleagues here to respond to these fantastic questions. So thank you all for being with us. I'm also going to invite my colleague Alana, who's been tracking the Q&A, to jump in with the first question.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Charlotte. Thank you so much for leading this webinar so far, and thank you to all of our fantastic panelists. This has been really great. Thank you for all of you who have been adding your questions into our Q&A. Please keep them coming so we can pass them on to our panelists. The first question that I'm going to ask is from Andrea, and I'm wondering if Annie, maybe you could talk a little bit about this. Andrea asks if INEE intends to use the framework as advocacy tool vis-a-vis main EIE donors so that they streamline, harmonize their reporting requirements towards promoting a common set of EIE M&E framework.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for the question, Andrea. And I saw there was some similar questions that came up as well, related to how we're thinking about these indicators vis-a-vis other donors, other organizations that already have potentially their own indicator frameworks. So this question has come up frequently, and I think the challenge that we faced is that every agency, every donor has their own strategic and operational priorities. And so they each pretty much have their own indicator framework already. And what we did was we tried to pull all of those frameworks together, as Amy discussed, go through them and look for indicators that already mapped onto the minimum standards. And we used those indicators as whenever we possibly could. And we didn't try to create new indicators unless there was a real gap. And so we ended up with a framework that aligns sort of as much as possible with A, the minimum standards, and B, with indicator frameworks that were already out there being used by donors and by practitioners in the field. But we don't have a plan at this moment to try to get everyone on board to use this framework, because there are so many different sort of strategic priorities in each of these agencies, and it's a much bigger sort of piece of work to bite off to get everybody to start committing to the same indicator framework. However, some of us on the call are also involved in the new Education and Emergency INEE EIE Data Reference Group, the Education Emergencies Data Reference Group, and that group has a mandate to begin thinking about harmonization of education emergencies data across the ecosystem. And I think, coming up with agreeing on some sort of core indicators may be one of the outcomes of that group. And so thinking about how the minimum standards fits into that is a conversation we've started having in the EIE data reference group. So it's sort of a parallel process, I might say. So I think the point is, we're not trying to get anybody to commit to being forced to use these indicators or being required to use these indicators at this point. A bigger conversation around that might be happening going forward. Yeah, hopefully this framework, which really aligns with the minimum standards, provides a sort of a tool and a way forward for doing that with the minimum standards in mind. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, I might just jump in on that, Annie, and thanks, really helpful reflection. And I guess to come at it from the other angle in terms of INEE's wider advocacy efforts around the standards and encouraging donor colleagues, ministry colleagues, all of us to use them more and more. I do think these tools will actually help with those ongoing advocacy efforts, because there's something so concrete and tangible for colleagues to use. So I actually see this as really helpful in our wider advocacy for the standards. So we might end up coming at this from both angles, which would be really positive.
Great. Thank you both. I'm going to ask one more question about the indicator framework before jumping to some of our great questions about the competency framework. But Allison asked about discussions with groups like ECW and GEC about their promotion and use of framework at country level. I'm wondering if Annie or Amy or anyone else who would like to jump in and answer this one, if you could.
Amy or Sebastian, do you want to jump in here?
I can certainly say a couple of words. I mean, I think certainly during the development of the framework, we did have colleagues from ECW and from the Global Education Cluster involved in the development and the reviews. So a similar response to Annie's, in terms of it's a bit of a chicken and an egg, I guess, in terms of we don't want to enforce, and it's certainly not the purpose to enforce these, but again, where there is overlap and where it does make sense to start merging, then I think that would be something desirable. But as a group, we're not in a position to be able to enforce that, and I don't think that would be a good way forward anyway, and particularly given that there's been so much work going on with the different indicator banks associated to the two groups. I think personally, I think there's probably quite a lot of overlap anyway, in terms of some of the, a lot of the purposes around, I guess thinking around things like attendance or measuring proficiency levels, or there's quite a lot of overlap anyway, I would say, in some of them. And so I think perhaps identifying those and seeing if there's some sort of coherence there would be a first step. But Annie, I don't know, again, that might fall into the reference group as sort of the natural sort of progression from our work into sort of the next year or two.
Yeah, to add, I think it is definitely something for the new reference group to focus on. And yeah, ECW were quite heavily involved in the middle of last year on sort of refining the final versions of that, and have their own contextualized version that they developed at the time. And I believe, Kathleen, correct me if I'm wrong, but the cluster is one of the organizations piloting or being involved in the pilot.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're working with the REACH side of the Global Education Cluster, so the needs assessment side. We're not able to pilot it probably on the programmatic side, just because I think the cluster has such a hard time coordinating indicators to begin with. So we're still having conversations about that, but it's definitely going to happen on the plan, the needs assessment side.
Great, thank you all. To jump really quickly over to the competency framework, lots of great questions coming in. Please keep keep asking all of the questions, but we have two questions. The first, I'm wondering if we can touch a little bit on how the framework is linked or connected with, in the question, it's the SPHERE standards, but other humanitarian standards overall. I'm wondering if Charlotte or Jeff, you would be able to touch on that. And then we also had a really great question from Peter about reading through the question. Professionalism is great, standardization might be great, but we risk losing some of the human factor. So how do we avoid the perceived barriers for entry into the sector that are perceived to be too high and perhaps too Northern dominated and Northern defined? Is that a valid concern? I'm wondering if both of you could maybe touch on that, or if anybody else would like to jump in, feel free.
I mean, perhaps if I just start with the SPHERE connection. So just a reminder that the minimum standards themselves are based on very much on the core beliefs of of SPHERE and the Humanitarian Charter, and also modelled in terms of their function. So this is all part of the Humanitarian Standards Partnership. So the framework itself that we've used for both tools is very much connected to SPHERE and the work there. And INEE are very active as part of that Humanitarian Standards Partnership. And so it was really great for both of these tools to be learning from colleagues in other sectors while we did that, and particularly child protection colleagues. I don't know, Jeff, if you wanted to maybe mention a bit more about that child protection linkage.
Yeah, so the Child Protection Alliance, they launched their professional development framework in the last couple of months as well. So again, like I mentioned before, we actually worked on an annex which kind of explicitly shows the overlap between the two sectors at the competency and skill level, to make it a little bit more, clear for sector practitioners. So we were quite intentional with child protection specifically. We hadn't done that with other sector actors, which is probably a good idea to do or to look at in the future. But we felt that child protection, because there's just so many clear overlaps between the two sectors, and it's really kind of a key area of integration, that was a good place to start from. On the second question, it's a really good question. I think, this is certainly not intended to create any sort of barriers for entry. It was meant to kind of fill a gap in terms of understanding, minimum skill levels and different competency areas. So this is certainly not saying like, don't hire somebody if they're not at skill level 1. It just provides a benchmark for staff to progress through their careers against these different competencies and skills. I think the minimum standards were created in a highly participatory fashion globally. And that was the reason why we wanted to base this competency framework on the minimum standards, just because the minimum standards kind of development process was really strongly rooted at kind of practitioner and country level. So again, the goal is just to professionalize, but certainly not to create barriers to entry. But it's a really good question, really important point to reflect upon. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd add to that as well, Jeff. Really important question for us and to think about, but I agree, Jeff. I think the hope was the opposite, and that actually, and I see Sonia's comment about the risk of professional development being too kind of one size fits all in the framework, ideally helping us be more nuanced and meaningful in the way we do professional development and recruitment. So we hope it'll be the opposite, and we're certainly trying to use it to try and ensure that professional development opportunities, as well as access to the sector, is more informed and more inclusive. But we'll keep that in mind, Peter, as we continue to work with the framework.
Great. Just a few more quick questions. We're getting close to the end of our time today. We did have one question from Camilla about indicators on distance learning impact, which I feel like is very important during these COVID times. I'm wondering if Sebastian or Amy, you'd be able to answer that really quickly.
I put a quick response actually just now. That's fine. I was just typing as we were talking, and I think the short answer is no. We did sort of have a discussion as a group in terms of whether we wanted to do sort of a COVID response or incorporate sort of COVID into the indicator bank, but we didn't go down that route. But I think it's important to say that would be another contextualization piece. So a lot of the indicators can be adapted to a distance learning context. It would just be being explicit again around sort of what the definition is and sort of what the tools might be and what the numerator and denominators are. So in terms of attendance, it's attendance to the distance learning sessions and sort of the proficiency levels, even things like referrals, child protection. Again, you know, that's something that's really important to measure within distance learning and to keep children and learners safe. So I think it would require more work around what tools would be appropriate, but the indicators are adaptable and useful for that context as well. Thanks.
Great. I do see we have a question about some of the specifics on the indicator framework piloting. I'm wondering about prerequisites for the organizations, for example, registered NGOs, community organizations, etc. Kathleen, do you mind just answering that question a little bit more about what kind of organizations we're looking for with this piloting process?
Sure. Yeah, we're looking for a nice range of kind of all the different organizations you just mentioned. So local NGOs, INGOs, UN bodies, the cluster, donor organizations. So the full range. Right now we have on board People in Need, University of Nairobi, and JRS. So, and then also we're going to be working with REACH through the Global Education Cluster. They don't have a needs assessment planned right now, so we're hoping that something will pop up between now and June, but that's our current spread, and it would be great to add you know, maybe a local or another type of organization, and we're also trying to get a nice spread geographically so that there's a good geographic representation as well, and different types of programs that are using the tools. So it's not just all, you know, primary education projects. There's some higher ed and things like that. So yeah, we're trying to get a nice spread.
Great. All right. I see we only have a few minutes left, so I'm wondering if we can kind of wrap up just by, I'd love to hear for both, maybe very quick, I'm sure we could talk about this for a while, but what kind of impact do you expect this tool, the tool that you created, to have on the EIE sector? What do you hope, what kind of impact do you hope it will have? Jeff, and then any of our team who's worked on the indicator framework, feel free to answer.
Just for the competency framework, I think our goal again was just to increase the professionalism, to have clear, you know, skill levels, nuanced skill levels for practitioners to look at, to set their own individual professional development goals and to grow professionally on an individual level, and also obviously organizationally. So I think that's ultimately the goal, is to help practitioners to set, you know, personal goals for themselves and to see their kind of professional growth. So yeah, that's the overarching goal for us anyway.
I can say a really quick thing about the indicator framework, and then maybe Amy wants to jump in. But for me, the impact is really about making the minimum standards easier to use, so that when somebody picks them up and wants to use them, they know kind of what an appropriate indicator might be to know whether or not they're actually meeting the standards within a program, within a set of programs, whatever. And so it's really meant to be just a very practical way of using the standards and being able to measure progress against them, to be used in any way possible. And that's why our pilot is focusing on usage and very broad, and just seeing how different people or different organizations might be using the indicators. And one of the reasons this came about was because someone asked about the sphere standards earlier. When we were looking at other indicator or other standards used across different sectors, we realized that I think education and emergencies was one of the only ones to not have indicators associated with the minimum standards for that sector. And so we realized it was something that was a gap, it was missing, and would be a very practical way to make the standards more useful and more user-friendly. So that's really, I think, our impact and our goal. But Amy, jump in, please.
You said it all. It's exactly that.
Great. Thank you all so much to the panelists and our wonderful participants. I think it's been great to see comments and reflections come in as well as the questions. So we'll capture those, and I really do think they'll inform our work moving forward. I've been doing a lot of trainings on the minimum standards recently, and sharing these tools has been really excited to see how they do fill that gap for many of our members that you've mentioned. But we really do want to learn more about this. So we really do encourage you all to use these tools and let us know how you're finding them. And I really do hope we can do another webinar down the line to hear from all of you, and to learn lessons from this together. But just a reminder that you can find everything on the website. Please stay in touch. As I say, INEE exists for you, all of you. So please keep this conversation going as we put the standards into practice together. But thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.